Hello and welcome to London Vārta, a Cine Ink podcast about newsmakers. I'm Pervaiz Alam. Once the British daily The Independent described Gideon Levy as the most hated man in Israel and perhaps the most heroic. Millions of people read his opinion pieces published in Haaretz. I'm one of them. It was sheer pleasure meeting Gideon Levy at the 11th Jaipur Literature Festival in London. He comes across as absolutely unassuming, soft-spoken, with the looks of a handsome actor with a baritone voice, of course. I go to him, introduce myself. Hello, I'm Pervaiz Alam. I read your editorial pieces on regular basis. I wonder if I could record an interview with you. He says, yes, tomorrow. Described as one of the most outspoken critics of Israel's policies against the Palestinian people, Levy calls Israel an apartheid state. He has reported extensively from the occupied Palestinian territories. He has documented the atrocities committed against the Palestinians in his reports, including Israel's 2009 invasion of Gaza. His best-selling book, The Punishment of Gaza, portrays how the ground was prepared for the 2009 assault and documents its continuing effects. From 2005, the year of Gaza's liberation, through to 2009, Levy tracks the development of Israel's policy, which has abandoned the pretense of diplomacy in favor of raw military power. I began my interview with Gideon Levy by asking him, how do you look at the 7th of October attack on Israel by Hamas?
Like everything in life, also the 7th of October has a context. I know Israelis don't like to hear it, and they blame you immediately that you justify what happened in the 7th. No, I don't justify what happened. I condemn it bitterly. It was criminal, and it didn't serve even the Palestinian cause for long, but it has a context. It was not out of the blue sky. When you put 2.3 million people for 18 years now in the biggest cage in the world, you should expect any kind of resistance and struggle, even the most brutal and cruel and criminal one. And this is what we faced.
And then the aftermath. Did you notice anything special with that attack on the 7th of October? You have seen Hamas acting against Israeli installations, Israeli targets. What was so different this time on the 7th of October?
The difference was their success, their operational success, which I don't think they even had foreseen such a success. And it's not their success, it's the colossal failure of the Israeli army. This is the main surprise, because the intentions of Hamas are not new, and we knew always that they would try as much as they can to penetrate into Israel. But who thought that they can do it with all the devices, that all the money that Israel had invested in the border between Gaza and Israel? And then they come on their motorcycles and pickup cars and just went into the kibbutzim and start to slaughter people. Nobody could foresee that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are so weak, so fragile, so unprofessional after all the money that was invested in them.
But the questions you have raised just now are not being asked in Israel. I mean, you are an exception, Gideon Levy, and for being an exception, you have your own enemies in Israel. Why aren't they asking those questions in Israel? And I mean, in terms of majority of the people.
I don't think I'm a better person than the other Israelis, but I don't live in denial, while most of the Israelis live in denial. The Israeli media helps them to live in denial, not to know, not to see, not to be accountable for anything, and to believe that we have the right to do whatever we want, and there is no one else around us. And if there is someone around us, if there is another people living next to us, dehumanize them, and then there are no moral doubts. Once you dehumanize them, then there are no moral questions, and no questions about morality and human rights and international law. They are not human beings, so there is no... All this goes through the veins of the Israelis for many years. And especially after a traumatic event like the 7th of October, it was intensified. Israelis think right now, most of the Israelis, that after what happened on the 7th of October, they can do whatever they want and nobody can stop them. Until now, they were convinced to be right.
Gideon Levy, I know that you face the wrath of the establishment in Israel. Describe it for me.
My problem is not with the establishment. My problem is with the people in the street. With the establishment, I can't complain. No pressure, no threats, nothing. I mean, I have no problems with the Israeli establishment on a personal basis. My problem is that, to realize that in this war, even the best of my friends changed their minds. And to feel that nobody wants to hear and nobody wants to know, and everyone is hostile toward any expression which might bring us to the thought that the Palestinians are human beings. This is unacceptable now.
And you think that's in the majority of the cases?
That's almost all the cases.
So this means that suppose there's a ceasefire tomorrow, probably Benjamin Netanyahu will not be there. What about the other things? Would they remain the same, or they're likely to change in terms of having a long-term peace between these two nations, let's put it this way, Israel and Palestinians?
No, we are farther than ever from this. Nobody even speaks about it. Nobody dreams about it. And very few want it, I must be frank with you. Everyone wants peace. But the conditions that the Israelis want now are totally impossible conditions. They want peace with all the rights. They want peace with maintaining the apartheid. And this doesn't work and will never work. So we are far away even to discuss this now, because we are in the lowest point ever since the State of Israel and the State of India were established on the same year.
It's very rare for an Israeli to call the system apartheid. Why do you call it apartheid?
I don't know any other definition. If you go to the West Bank and you see two villages, one has all the resources and all the rights, and the other one has no resources and no any civil rights, including even not citizenship, how else can you call it if not apartheid? I don't know another name. I mean, it looks like apartheid, it walks like apartheid, and it is apartheid for many years.
How would you describe the situation in West Bank? I'm not talking about Gaza. What has happened since October the 7th in West Bank?
Because nobody is talking about the West Bank, the settlers took over, and they are doing things together, obviously, with the army that they would never dare to do before. First of all, we have to remember that hundreds of Palestinians, I think it's over 500 now, maybe more, were killed in those months. You never heard about it. Secondly, thousands, many thousands were arrested, kidnapped, we should say, because most of them were not brought to court. The Israeli democracy is holding thousands of Palestinians without trial in jail. This cannot meet basic criteria of a democracy, having thousands of people in jail without trial. And above all, the settlers became more violent than ever, and they are taking over and confiscating more and more lands from the Palestinian shepherds, usually from the weakest ones, and they do it on a daily basis, and there is no one to stop them and no one to protect the shepherds.
Gideon Levy, the world is talking about a two-state solution. Of course, they have been discussing it for such a long time, and in fact, there were lots of countries that they had already recognized Palestine as a nation. I remember India in 1988 had recognized the Palestinian state. And now about 150 countries have recognized Palestine as a state. Now, I understand that you were a supporter of the two-state solution. I guess you are not anymore supporting the two-state solution. So what is it that you are supporting now?
First of all, I'm a great supporter of the two-state solution. I just am so convinced that it will never happen. It will never be implemented, because it can't be implemented anymore with 700,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem. and nobody in Israel will ever be able to evacuate 700,000 settlers, mainly because they are the strongest political group in Israeli politics. So continue to speak about the two-state solution is playing into the hands of the occupation. It means we have on the shelf, we have some solution, and one day we'll use it. And this is very comfortable for the EU, for the United States, even for the Palestinian Authority, and obviously even for Israel. Yeah, two-state solution. One day, not now. When? We don't know. And occupation gets stronger and stronger. The two-state solution is the train that left the station, and there is only one alternative to two-state solution.
And what is that?
And the alternative is only the one-state solution. Now you will ask me, one state, how will they live together?
Of course, I'm going to ask you.
How will they live together, those with all the hatred and the fears? So I must tell you, first of all, they are living together for decades. We are in a one state. We don't have to create it. It is there. All the Palestinians between the river and the sea are living under Israeli control, under Israeli rule. And the only thing that should be changed is the regime of this one state. And we have to start to work on it. At least we have a vision of one person, one vote, this very basic thing for democracy, outspoken thing, namely equality. That's the only thing we are asking for, equality. And if Israel says no to equality, Israel by itself declares itself as an official, formal apartheid state. We have to work it. We have to change the discourse, not to speak about settlers and not about boundaries, but about democratization between the river and the sea. One democratic state.
Gideon Levy, do you really think it's going to happen? Even two-state solution is a problem for Israel and for lots of Israel supporters.
Two-state solution is off the table. It's not that it's an option at all. And we are facing now two remain alternatives. This one state which exists can be either an apartheid state or a democracy. If the world will decide that it does not interfere like it did with the first apartheid state, and let it go, so we will live forever in an apartheid state. If the world will decide that it will treat this apartheid state in the same tools like the first apartheid state, we might see a democracy. I have no guarantees, but there is no third choice.
Okay, Gideon Levy, just allow me to ask a couple of questions about you, your parents, family, just a little bit. I understand your parents, mother and father separately, they came from Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, but
that used to be Czechoslovakia.
Right.
That was the time.
Yeah.
And somehow they reached what we call now Israel. And then your grandparents were not able to make it. What happened?
So they came separately, as you rightly said. My father was from a German area in Czechoslovakia, the Sudetim, where German was the language and the Germans were the people there. And he felt quite assimilated. He had no interest, not in Zionism and very little in Judaism, until 1939, when Hitler penetrated into Czechoslovakia, his first aggressive step. My father went on an illegal boat, which was for 5 months in the sea. 5 months, I don't know how they made it. 600 people on a small boat for 5 months on the sea. No port would accept them, no port, until they were detained in Beirut, Lebanon, by the Brits. And finally, they made it illegally into Palestine. He said goodbye to his parents and fiancée in the railway station of Prague in 1939. He said goodbye to his academic career because he had a PhD in law, which he would never use anymore in Israel. And he started a new life here. He started with his PhD in law in baking cakes and going from door to door and offering his cakes on the bicycle.
Your father opened a bakery shop, yeah?
Yes, and not only this, he used to knock on the door of people and offer his cakes. That's
Right.
the way he made his living with a PhD in law. But this is the fate of refugees. My mother came with a special project then of saving children from the Holocaust. So she came at 16 without her parents, alone, to a kibbutz. Her parents made it and came in 42 to Israel. My father's parents never made it.
What happened to them?
They both died. We know very little about it, but we know that they got to Treblinka, to one of the extermination camps. And my grandfather might have died from a disease. My grandmother was murdered. But I know too little about it.
Gideon Levy, this much I know about you. I've read, of course, on the net. As a child, as a youngster, you grew up in a very religious kind of an atmosphere, which means that you were a nationalist. You were a supporter of the Zionism, right? And
like everyone else in Israel of those times. Not religious, but Zionist.
Zionist.
Like everyone else. There were no exceptions at those years. No exception. There was no room for exception because we were quite brainwashed by the education system.
And you joined the Defense Forces, IDF.
Right.
You worked with them.
Absolutely. I was a good boy, Tel Aviv.
But the good, interesting thing from my point of view is, as a radio man, as a broadcaster who has worked for a long time in radio, that you were working for the Israeli radio as a reporter?
Not the Israeli, the army radio
The
station.
army radio, of course.
Yeah,
And,
even
yes.
worse than this. Yeah, I was a reporter, I was an editor, I was a presenter. 4 years I did it. I enjoyed it a lot. There were very happy years then.
This was in 1970s, I suppose.
Right.
Right. And
Right.
then you came back and joined the newspaper?
No, before I was 4 years the aide of Shimon Peres.
Oh, Shimon Peres, yes, you were working with him, the man
for 4
who,
years, yeah.
the man who was the prime minister of Israel on several occasions.
And president.
And president, of course. A
I
legendary man.
Absolutely. I worked with him when he was chairman of Labour and leader of the Israeli opposition for 4 years.
And after that you joined Haaretz,
Right.
the
At
newspaper.
82, at 82.
The progressive and left-wing newspaper in Israel.
And ever since I'm there, many, many decades.
You became also their deputy editor for some time.
For some time, but don't mention it because those were not the happiest years. I like to be outside the offices, to be in the field.
Now you're a columnist with the Haaretz.
Right.
And you also write for various newspapers?
No, only for Haaretz.
In English and Hebrew?
Right. Haaretz is maybe the only or one of the very few newspapers in the world which appears every day in 2 languages.
How things changed for you? A great supporter of Zionism, just like any other, of course, in Israel. And then very right-wing in your approach.
No, not very. I was never very right-wing in my approach.
Okay.
No. I was center, like everyone, average.
And serving the army, and now you say very difficult things for the IDF actually to digest, the things that you say against the failure of the Israeli defense system and the failure of the Israeli government in terms of protecting the Palestinian lives as well. So that is unheard of in a way. That what changed for you? How did you become progressive, or be it left-winger, or maybe a kind of a considerate person?
Only one thing. I started to travel to the occupied territories many, many years ago. A thing that most of my colleagues and almost all the Israelis never do. And I started to document the crimes there. In the beginning, quite accidentally, here, there, some stories, until I realized that I want to dedicate my career to covering the occupation. And the more I saw, the more radical I became.
And now, how do you describe yourself now? I read somewhere that you call yourself a patriot.
Yes, because I think that patriotism does not mean obeying blindly to nationalism. By all means not. My patriotism, I care about Israel. I care a lot about Israel. I never left Israel and I have no intention to leave Israel. That's my place. I was born there. I'll die there. And I'm very much invested emotionally in Israel. And therefore, I allow myself to call myself a patriot because I care about the future of Israel. But I'm not a Zionist.
You're not a Zionist anymore?
No.
What's wrong with Zionism, by the way?
Zionism today means Jewish supremacy between the river and the sea. And I cannot live in peace with any kind of national supremacy over another nation.
No, river and the sea, you said it, I haven't said it. The moment I say it, probably somebody would declare me as anti-Semitic.
Right.
What's wrong with this expression, anti-Semitism? Because every second person who criticizes the Israeli army, particularly, is called anti-Semitic.
Because that's a very manipulative way of propaganda, of Israeli and Jewish propaganda, namely to label any criticism on Israel as anti-Semitism. And surprise, surprise, it's working like hell. Europe is totally paralyzed. You cannot raise your voice against Israel in Europe because immediately you are labeled as an anti-Semite. And Europe is still remembering the Holocaust, and rightly so. And to be labeled as an anti-Semite is really a stain still, and it should be a stain. The only problem is that not every critic, each critic of Israel is an anti-Semite. But that's the manipulation of Israeli propaganda, and unfortunately Europe fall into this trap.
What's the problem with Europe? Is it a kind of a guilt conscience?
Yes, absolutely.
What sort of guilt?
They all carry some kind of guilt about what happened 70, 80 years ago.
Some of them find themselves somehow involved in that, maybe Germany to an extent, but what about the other nations?
No, every nation has its own stain in Europe. There were very few who really resisted Nazism. Don't forget that we had many collaborators, and for sure about saving the Jews, their own citizens. Almost all countries did nothing. There were 2-3 exceptions, like Bulgaria, like Denmark, but most of the countries did nothing about saving their Jewish citizens. And that's a guilt feeling, a very justified one, but it shouldn't be manipulated for political purposes.
For Israel, the enemy number one is, of course, a Palestinian, but then, in other words, a Muslim. Let's put it this way. Let's call a spade a spade.
Yes.
Do you really think that the Muslims are the enemies of Israel, or Jews? Let's put it this way.
I don't even think the Palestinians are enemies of Jews. I think that once we'll treat the Palestinians with some kind of justice, no, total justice will never be, but with some kind of justice and respect, we will be surprised how hatred can be really. I don't want to say there will be no resistance. There will always be resistance to the state of Israel in Palestine, or to any kind of presence of Jews in Palestine. But it will be marginal. I don't think it's about being enemies. I think it's about making justice prevail.
How can the Jews live in peace and tranquility? I'm talking about the threats that are likely to come from various quarters.
It's again the denial that they live in. They all live in a denial, and the media is collaborating with this. Israelis don't give themselves a full report about the reality that they created.
What about you? I mean, do you really think that, some sort of peace is possible between Israel and the Palestinians and the Jews and the Muslims?
Right now, not. It's off the table, and I think peace should be the bonus. We should work on creating some kind of justice. Peace will come later.
Do you think that there could be a good relationship between the Jews and the Christians?
But Jews and Christians, even Jews and Muslims, for centuries had good relations. We are all human beings, finally. Surely it can be possible. You just have to create the right conditions and to stop the incitement and to stop the hatred and the fear. It's also fear, not only hatred, from both sides.
Let me ask you about those people who live in India and Pakistan and other countries and maybe Arab countries as well. They love reading your pieces because you are progressive, you are talking about the Palestinian rights, you're criticizing the Israeli government. But then the same people, I say it as a journalist, find they lack courage to write about their own societies and against their own governments. How do you survive, and what would be the lessons, what would be the tips that you would like to share with those people who in their respective countries would like to emulate Gideon Levy? Maybe they would like to follow your path. Maybe they would like to be the voice of resistance in their own countries. What are those tips?
First of all, it might be, I don't know enough, but it might be an unfair comparison because Israel finally, at least until now, I don't know what will be, for its Jewish citizens, is a real liberal democracy. So I'm privileged, very privileged. First of all, I'm Jewish in Israel. Secondly, I work for Haaretz, which is a well-established newspaper. And until now, I didn't pay a price in terms of going to jail, which might be the case in your country and in other countries around. So first of all, the price that I'm paying, the personal price, is quite limited. There is a price, I don't deny, but I guess you need more courage to be a dissident in India or in Pakistan or obviously in Afghanistan or obviously in Iran than to be a dissent in Israel. Israel is still more tolerable. And the fact that I am free, not only free physically, but also free to speak out, even with you, even here or elsewhere, I don't take it for granted. It might change one day. But if you ask about tips, it's very easy for me to say, and it's not always implementable in every country. But I know one thing. Say what you really believe in. Again, it's so easy to throw this cliche and to say, go to jail, spend half of your life then in jail and feel good about yourself. No. This is a little arrogant for me to say so. In the conditions that Israel provided me, saying the truth and paying a limited price is the best deal in town.
I understand your newspaper, Haaretz, faced some problems during the last 3-4 months. It is still facing problems. And I was just going through a news story there that it was redacted. This was about the Mossad chief. So there are certain restrictions on newspapers in Israel.
There is censorship in Israel, military censorship, which is very, very limited. And by far, it's not an excuse for Israeli media not to speak up. By all means, it's not an excuse. The military censorship shouldn't be. It's the only so-called democracy in the world which has a censorship at all. But that's not the problem of Israeli media, by far not. I wish this would be the problem. The problem in Israeli media is self-censorship.
Thank you very much, Gideon Levy. It's a pleasure, it's an honor, it's a privilege talking to you.
Same for me. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. That was Gideon Levy, Israeli journalist and commentator. His book, The Punishment of Gaza, is a bestseller. It's available online. In his latest book, The Killing of Gaza Reports on a Catastrophe, Levy discusses the destruction of Gaza by bringing together his on-the-ground perspectives of the events leading up to the 7th of October and the following devastation of Gaza. Cine Ink podcasts are available on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. You can find all details on our website, cineink.com. You can write to us, post@cineink.com. Thanks for listening. This is Pervaiz Alam signing off. Goodbye.